And we are live. Sweet. Welcome to the Salty Nerd Podcast. I am your host, the Salty Nerd. In today's podcast, we're going to be doing an interview with our mutual friend on Twitter, Matthew Kadish. Before we get started, though, I would like to do a quick shout out to our sponsor, Organically Wonderful. Organically Wonderful is a family-owned business. My wife is working her butt off to get it off the ground. And it's 100% organically made products. Her products include dry shampoo, a body oil in a full size and travel size, and a lemon cream body scrub, which is my personal favorite. If you would like to support the podcast, please go to organicallywonderful.com and check out what you can see there. Anything that you buy inadvertently supports this podcast because the more money she makes, the less I have to work. And with that out of the way, we'll introduce our guest, the Amazon published author of Earthman Jack saga. He recently wrote a 4-part series on the inner workings of the licensing and distribution of Star Trek and how it has negatively affected the series throughout the years. Please welcome our guest, the insightful and super nice guy, Matthew Kadish. What's up, Matt? How you doing?
Doing good, Salty. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I've been excited about this. I know I asked you a couple weeks ago, and we finally got our schedules down to where we can sit down and have a nice chat. I'm glad we can do this.
Also, what's your sponsor's name again?
Organically Wonderful.
Yeah, so my girlfriend tried some Organically Wonderful products, and she's a world-class esthetician. She works at a big spa down here in Las Vegas, and she's really liking those products. She thinks they're very clean and they're very effective, and she has a lot of good things to say about them.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it, man. Thank you for the shout out. I appreciate that. So tell your girlfriend I appreciate it as well.
Will do.
My wife, she's been working on this project for almost 3 years now. It's slow going because it's kind of a side business for us, and she's very passionate about it. She's putting her 100% into it. So
it's amazing how many crazy chemicals are put into beauty products, like stuff that gets absorbed by the skin. So like when you have products that are effective and also have just clean ingredients, so that that you're not going to be subjecting yourself to any like weird toxins or chemicals or stuff like that, it really does make a difference.
Yeah, 100%. And that's one of the things, the reason why she made this business was basically she couldn't find anything on the market that she wanted to use. So she just started making her own stuff. And then that kind of morphed into, well, if I can't find anything for me, I might want to, try and help other people out. And that turned into trying to sell these products. But enough about me. How about you? Amazon author. So tell me a little bit about Tell me about your history. How did you get started with writing stories? I know you have a little bit of a history in Hollywood. Was that before you were an author or after?
That was before. So I went to film school back when I was young, and was a screenwriter, director, stuff like that. And I was the semifinalist in this thing called the Nickel Fellowship Screenwriting Contest. And that it's kind of like a big prestigious screenwriting thing where, the winner gets a grant, and typically the winner of this contest gets their movie made into a feature film type thing. So, I didn't win it, but I finished relatively high, and that got me an invite to the Los Angeles Film School's feature development program. And at the time I was living in Pennsylvania, kind of futzing around after college because I went to Penn State. And when I got this invitation, I was like, sweet, now I have an excuse to go out to Hollywood. So nice. I moved out there and went through this program, ended up making a film starring Jeremy Renner, the actor who plays Hawkeye in the Avengers, way before he was a famous Oscar-nominated actor. And took that to the Cannes Film Festival in 2004, and that opened up a lot of doors for me, and I kind of did the Hollywood thing for a bit, until I realized I really hated begging people for money. So it was something that just kind of withered and died on the vine for me, especially because I started my own business and I started making really good money at that. And I decided, instead of being the starving artist, I preferred to, be able to pay my rent and, buy myself nice stuff. So kind of gave up on the filmmaking thing. And with my business, I was doing some creative stuff. It was in advertising and marketing and things like that. So I kind of had that itch scratched. And one year I was like, I really miss telling stories, because that had always been my motivation, and getting into, filmmaking was to tell stories. And the hard thing about filmmaking is that you need, money, you need actors, you need equipment, you need all this stuff to make like, a professional looking movie. And I didn't want to have to deal with any of that. And so I was like, writing, all you need is a computer, or at the very least, a notepad and paper. So I decided that I was going to make a New Year's resolution to write a novel. I'd never written a novel before. I'd written plenty of screenplays, but never a novel. And I wanted to basically just see if I could do it. And I'd had this idea in my head since college where I basically had a dream about a young boy who finds a magic spaceship at the center of the earth. And that was basically, the gist of the dream. But it always kind of stuck with me. And throughout the years, I'd kind of, expanded upon it and written it down and figured out, some story ideas for it. And I decided that was going to be what I was going to use as my first foray into novel writing. And that's what eventually became the Earthman Jack space saga. And I spent about 5 years working on the first book because I was working on it just kind of off and on in my spare time. But after my business shut down in the recession of 2008, it hung on for a couple of years after that, but I eventually had to close shop. Moved out to Las Vegas, kind of wanting to start my life anew, and decided, I'm gonna do the novel writing thing full time. And that's what I've been doing since 2012. And so we've got 5 books out in the series so far, working on the next one right now. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been very creative and fulfilling and frustrating and annoying. So it's everything you could possibly want from an artistic endeavor, I guess.
Right on. So this story that you created, it all stemmed from a dream that you had?
Yeah, when I was in college, I may or may not have been drunk at the time. I don't remember, but I remember waking up one morning and having this image of, it was almost like watching a Spielberg movie play out, where you have this like young kid, and he goes into like this weird kind of mystical temple, and there's this big magic spaceship there. And that was all I really had to go off of, was this, kid finding a magic spaceship. And so over time, that kind of grew into something that was a little bit more influenced by like the Flash Gordon serials and Star Wars and basically every science fiction movie I ever grew up loving. And I took all elements from all that stuff and kind of mushed it together in a ball and said, what would it be like if Steven Spielberg made this movie? And the story for Earthman Jack sprung from that. And in a weird way, it's a lot like the Game of Thrones stuff, not in the sense that it's like adult and bloody and stuff. It's just, it's gotten really big and complicated because it's a space opera. So it's got multiple different stories going on a galactic scale. And I'm the type of writer where I like to sit down and, really do a lot of intense world building and figure out how everything works. And so, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff I do where I sit down and map out a story Bible that has all these elements in it in excruciating detail. And most of it never makes it into the books, but it's just for my reference and things of that nature.
That's pretty cool. So you got a lot of that same vibe from the Spielberg 1980s adventure, like young adult adventure movies. And I'm in chapter 4, I think, of the book so far that you gave me. Thank you, by the way, for giving me one of these books. That was super awesome of you. And I noticed right away that the main character, Jack, reminds me very much of like a Marty McFly type. He's kind of the not so good kid. He's kind of off on his own. He does his own thing. He doesn't really follow the rules. He's always getting in trouble. He's kind of the outcast, and it's kind of endearing because immediately and then it reminded me of Marty McFly. And then we and you were talking earlier about his favorite teacher in high school as a professor, and you draw inspiration from Doc Brown with him, which is it's really cool because you didn't tell me about the Marty McFly thing, but when you told me about the Doc Brown thing, I'm like, that totally makes sense. You really captured that same essence just in the first couple of chapters. I noticed that kind of thing. So it's a really cool, I guess, a community kind of a feeling that people get from those Spielberg movies, especially our age, people who grew up on those movies. It kind of has that very familiar feel to it.
Yeah, it's Earthman Jack's really kind of like my love letter to all the science fiction I grew up loving. And it's funny because in every book, I really layer in a lot of different Easter eggs. Some of them are a little bit more blatant than others. But the fans of the series, if you go on Amazon and check out the reviews, like they have a really fun time kind of going through and picking out like all these little references that I throw in there, because there's stuff I reference Star Wars, Star Trek, Stargate, pretty much anything with star in the title. Um, and a bunch of other things like Goonies. I know you hate Goonies, but that's in there somewhere. Firefly, basically everything that I loved as a kid, and of science fiction, I kind of pull from and do a wink and a nod to in these books, and people really seem to kind of get off on it. It's kind of funny. In fact, when I released my latest entry into the series, I put in like a list of Easter eggs that I've kind of put in throughout the series, and basically said, like, here's just a couple, see if you can find more. And I always get people emailing me and it's like, oh, I noticed this. Is this an Easter egg? Stuff like that. So it's kind of a fun little game that me and the readers play.
That's pretty cool. And is anybody in the books kind of captured from your personality? Have you put yourself in the book anywhere, or is it strictly just looking at pop culture and taking inspiration from that?
It's kind of like whenever you're writing, you always put a little bit of yourself into a character. So all the characters have bits and pieces of me in there. I think we can all relate to being a 15-year-old high school kid and liking this pretty girl and being all awkward and weird around her, and wanting to ask her out, but not having the guts to, but at the same time, you're willing to stand up to the school bully type thing. So, I try to basically pull from my own personal experience with every character that I write, but at the same time, I want to try to keep them realistic within themselves. So the answer to that's kind of yes and no. There's parts of me in every character in the series, but there's also like their own thing. Basically, at a certain point, they just kind of go off and do their own stuff without me.
That's pretty cool. What kind of what authors have you kind of like looked up to in creating your own novel and creating your own epic saga? Are you looking at Tolkien, Martin, and those classics? Do you have any others in specific?
There's the Peridian series by Lloyd Alexander, which I grew up loving. They're very short, very simple books. The Black Cauldron was one of them. Disney made a movie out of it.
Oh, okay.
But they're like a very simple fantasy tale, but they're so beautifully well written, and they're super short. They're definitely for kids. But when you read those, like I can remember, I think it was either the fourth book or the fifth book, the final one. There was a battle scene that brought a tear to my eye when I was rereading it as a teenager, and it's a beautiful series that really kind of inspired me. It's a classic hero's journey type thing. The Star Wars saga, of course, talking about the original trilogy, not the prequels or the new ones.
Yeah.
But George R.R. Martin, when I first read him in college, that's when I discovered Game of Thrones before it was a TV series. His writing had a huge effect on me. In fact, when I sat down to write my first book, I was like, I'm going to use George R.R. Martin's style as inspiration for my own style. And so he's probably had the biggest influence on me in terms of me actually writing novels. Mm-hmm. Back when I was writing screenplays, it was very different because it's hard to be inspired by other screenwriters just due to the format. But when it came to novel writing, yeah, I think Martin's probably had the biggest influence on me.
So are you like killing off a bunch of main characters and trying to keep the readers on edge?
Well, I don't want to answer that because it's spoilers, but I will say that it's really about, it's not about shocking the audience. It's more about what's appropriate for the story. And so I look at it like that. It's like, what is appropriate for this story? Where does it logically go? Because I don't know if a lot of people care about this or not, but I've studied storytelling for a very long time since I basically decided to be a filmmaker. I grew up reading comic books. I grew up reading graphic novels and other books and things like that, watching movies voraciously, lots of TV shows. I was a nerd, growing up.
As most of us are.
Yeah, but I was a professional nerd. I was a guy who, like, I wouldn't want to take a date to a movie because I didn't want to mix my pleasures. I'd be too involved in the movie to pay attention to my date type thing. So, just ever since I can remember, probably since I was like 14 or 15 years old, I've been studying storytelling and, trying to figure out what makes certain things work and what techniques there are and what concepts there are. And, when I was in college, I not only studied screenwriting, I studied literature, theology, bunch of stuff that had to do with, myths and writing and things of that nature. And I was very blessed to have some great mentors going through the film programs at both Penn State and the Los Angeles Film School. And because, filmmaking at its most base level is storytelling. It's about, sitting around the campfire and weaving a tale for other people to be entertained by. And so I wanted to learn every aspect of that. And I've been doing it for years. And now that I'm finally writing novels, I'm getting to really apply these concepts to my own work, and hopefully they're resonating with the audience and stuff. But it's really a lost art, because if you go to film school at like USC or New York University or any of these top film schools, they're going to teach you like how to work a camera. They're going to teach you about lighting and mise en scène and all the aspects of filmmaking, but they don't really tell you how to tell a good story. I think that's one of the problems with Hollywood right now, is that you have a whole generation of filmmakers who grew up learning how to frame a really cool shot and deal with really cool special effects, but not quite how to tell a good story. And I think that's a systemic issue in our society, is like people just don't know how to tell stories anymore.
Yeah. And it's a difficult thing. I mean, I grew up watching the same type of movies that you did, and I was never into the story so much. I never paid super close attention to the overarching characters and whatnot. I was just more looking at the spectacle, which is probably the same thing that directors these days were growing up on. They were looking at the spectacle, like you said, the VFX and being able to frame up a good shot. Like that kind of stuff impressed me as a kid. And getting into film more now because of the podcast and trying to educate myself so that I can actually have a valid opinion on these things, I find it harder to like people like you and several other people I follow on Twitter, the guys at Nerd Soup. They have some really good takes on certain movies, and really I guess educated takes on film and story, and I find myself trying to keep up. Like I was never into that kind of thing, so I'm a leg behind on everybody, and I'm trying to learn how to do it, but it's not as easy as you might think. Like there's a lot of plot holes and maybe character development things that me watching a movie would be like, oh, that looks totally fine, but then I hear your take on it, and I'll be like, oh, okay, so I see what you're seeing after you explain it to me. But if it was just me on my own, it probably would have just went right over my head. So there's something to say about having that background and education on actual like storycraft and building a good narrative for your characters.
Yeah, I mean, just take a movie like Predator, for instance, like the original 1980s Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, it was Shane Black directed that and wrote it, right?
No. Shane Black acted in it. He actually didn't have anything to do with the script. John McTiernan was the one who directed it.
Okay.
And John McTiernan, a very talented filmmaker, although, as his career went on, his movies kind of declined in quality. But if you look at that movie, so Predator is a lot of spectacle, right? It hits all the big blockbuster check marks, but it's also a very, very well told story. And you've got a group of very well-defined characters, and you've got a fairly simple monster movie plot wrapped up in a little bit of mystery. And then, like, you compare that to the latest Predator that just came out, where Shane Black did write and direct that one. And Shane Black, he's proven to be a pretty good screenwriter. Like, he wrote Lethal Weapon, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, stuff like that. So we know he's not a bad writer, but the Predator, the latest one that just came out, was awful. It was terrible. And so, like, you wonder, it's like, how is it that, a writer can, craft such a good movie, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and then today it's like he completely forgot everything, that made a good story to begin with. And I think one of the interesting things about movies is that you can never attribute the quality of a movie to any one thing. So, like, you might have a good director, but the writer's bad or the producer's bad, or you might have a good producer, but the director's bad. And, you might have a good script, but somebody messes it up because they want their girlfriend to take the lead role, So filmmaking is like a real collaboration medium, and you can't ever really, kind of point to one single person, be like, this is the reason why this story didn't work. Because you basically have a lot of cooks in the kitchen spoiling the soup, so to speak. I know when I worked in Hollywood, it was a constant battle because everyone has ideas, and especially if the person's putting up money for the production, they have a say in what and how the production is run. So if they say, I want Coca-Cola to be featured in the shot, and you're like, oh, we're doing a period piece, Coca-Cola didn't exist. It's like, well, it's too bad. I want a Coca-Cola in the shot. It's like you have no choice but to find some sort of compromise or fight them on it or what have you. But when you're when you're writing a novel, for instance, you have an unlimited budget. You don't have anyone kind of looking over your shoulder telling you what to do. And so I actually think novels are kind of a more pure look into the quality of somebody's storytelling ability, as opposed to a movie, because there's so many factors that go into making a movie good or bad. But
yeah, I think I
do think that movies in general, when they're being shepherded by people who understand story and character, they tend to be good. And when you have movies that are shepherded by people who are more concerned about art on the screen, or making a cool action scene or spectacle or what have you, the story tends to be secondary to that, and it tends to suffer.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to say, do you think studio like meddling with storytellers? So you have, oftentimes it's very obvious, almost every time a movie comes out, people will say, well, I read the book and the book was better. And it's kind of hard. I don't know if you can judge it on the same spectrum, because a book, you've got so much more time and room to flush out characters, whereas in a movie you have to do a certain amount of stuff. You have to project the story in like 2 hours or less in order to get the audience captivated. Is there a good middle ground where you think that it's some artistic licensing and a little bit of liberty with the work is okay, or do you think what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there are many examples out there of movies that within the 2-hour time frame have crafted incredible characters, engaging stories, stuff that stands the test of time. Like, I was tweeting about this earlier. I think it was last night, actually, where I was talking about Wayne's World. And Wayne's World came out in 1992. And most young people nowadays, they probably don't remember Wayne's World or haven't seen it or what have you. But you can watch that movie. Like, I remember watching it in 1992 and just laughing my butt off and just loving that movie. And I could watch that movie today and still love the characters, still laugh at all the jokes. It's just as funny now as it was back then. And, there are other movies too, like, for instance, Ghostbusters, the original Ghostbusters. I think we were talking about this over lunch a few days ago.
Yeah.
Where, the original Ghostbusters has very well-developed characters. It has a great story. It's got spectacle. It's basically got everything that you need to make a hit movie. And you can watch that movie today, even though it was made like 30 years ago, and it still holds up. It's still just as good today as it was back then. But then you have movies that, don't necessarily stand the test of time. They might have been cool when they first came out, but then you watch them today and you're just like, ooh, that didn't age well, know? So, I mean, it really comes down to understanding the core tenets of what makes a good story. And I think having a director who understands, directing is a very difficult profession. I don't think a lot of people really understand what goes into directing. It's not just about crafting the look and feel of a movie and telling people where to point the camera. It's about pulling out the right performances from the actors. It's about keeping track of the script and the story and knowing what needs to go into a movie in order to communicate what's happening on screen. It's a very multi-tiered profession, and it was one that I studied for a long time. And I think I was pretty good at it. I just never quite got the break that I needed to actually make these big movies that I wanted to make. But that's neither here nor there, because there are people out there who, a lot of directors nowadays kind of got their start on music videos. and music videos are all about the visuals.
Yeah.
Sometimes some of them might tell like a very basic story or what have you, but they're really all about making it look good. And so when they move over to feature films, and the same thing's true of commercials, because a lot of feature filmmakers kind of come from a commercial background as well. So when they move to feature films, they're taking that visual aesthetic with them, but they don't really have a sense of story,
Yeah.
That's the real issue, in my opinion, is like people just don't care about the story. They care about, the trailer moments. And I think that's sad, really, sometimes.
Do you think part of the problem, I'm sure you've noticed in recent, especially in Marvel, where they give these indie directors who maybe have like one or two films under the belt, a $250 million big budget blockbuster, and they want to give it like a fresh look or maybe new eyes and get some fresh blood in the franchise. Do you think that's a mistake? Do you think there's issues with that a director doesn't have time to kind of cut his teeth and get the experience he needs before taking on a bigger project? Or do you think that that's a good thing where people are getting an opportunity in Hollywood to go from zero to hero in the matter of like one or two films?
Well, I know that the reason Marvel does that is because they want a greater control over the story. It's like when they have auteurs come in, like people like Joss Whedon, for instance, they butt heads a lot because Joss Whedon has his own kind of style and thoughts about this stuff, and he's regarded as an auteur. And Marvel, they make their movies very similar to how TV shows are produced, in the sense that it's a producer's medium, where you have the producers who are actually kind of the ones who are guiding the production. And so they don't want a strong director at the helm. They want people who are going to do what they say, kind of like a TV director, and this is one of the reasons why so many Marvel movies are so similar to one another in terms of look and feel and things like that, because there's a consistent head at these Marvel movies, which are the producers, not necessarily the directors. And you saw this with Ant-Man, where Edgar Wright, who's a very, kind of stylistic director who did Shaun of the Dead and stuff like that, he was originally supposed to direct Ant-Man, and he was the guy who kind of took it through development. And, him and Marvel kept clashing, butting heads. And Marvel was eventually like, you got to go. Like, you're not playing the game we want you to play. And I think that, that aside, bringing in lesser experienced directors can be a good thing, because, you got to groom the next generation. But also, a lot of people don't really know that when you're on a multi-million-dollar budget film, it makes the director's job a lot easier, because they've got people in place to kind of do all the heavy lifting. Like when I was making movies as a director, I was running around, grabbing costumes and, getting food for lunch, to feed the crew, and basically, doing the independent filmmaker thing, where you're kind of a guerrilla style unit where you're just doing stuff as it pops up. But when it comes to, these $100 million movies, they make the director's job so easy, because they've got departments upon departments upon departments, where the director is like, I want everyone to wear yellow in this scene. And someone's like, we're on it, boss. And like the next thing you know, everyone's got a yellow costume on. So I think that, if you've got enough experience under your belt where you've made like $1 million movie or $3 million movie, I think Coogler, guy who directed Black Panther, he did Fruitvale Station, he did a couple movies, so he wasn't like a complete newbie, but Black Panther was his first big movie. I think he had enough experience where jumping into the big boy pool wasn't a thing for him, because by the time he was directing Black Panther, he was probably like, this is great. I don't have to work as hard. But someone like these two people who directed Captain Marvel, I know they did like, I think, one movie before this.
Yeah.
And it was a romantic comedy or something like that. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember the actual movie that they made, but that might have been a little bit too much, because I think Captain Marvel kind of got away from them a little bit. But then again, you have those strong producers there who kind of overseeing the production to make sure that they got everything that they needed, and that they did what they wanted, and things of that nature.
So seeing that Marvel has more or less succeeded in that kind of formulaic, like the studio and the producers have a lot of say, and they purposefully hire these younger directors so that they can kind of guide them into the direction they want to go. Where do you see the difference between like a Marvel formulaic issue with Kevin Feige behind everything and running the whole production, as opposed to where Lucasfilm tried to do, I think, a similar thing where they had Ryan Johnson. He was a fairly small time director. He did what, two, three movies before this, Brick, Looper, and then one other one. And then they also had Lord and Miller with Solo that just went straight to crap, and they ended up leaving. And there was a whole big issue with that. Where do you think the difference was between Kevin Feige running the show and then on Lucasfilm's end?
Well, Kathleen Kennedy's style of producing was very different from Kevin Feige's style. Feige, was very much about central control over the Marvel movies. So, he kind of took the James Bond approach. I don't know if you know anything about the James Bond films, but the estate that owns James Bond, they've always resisted, people like big directors, like for instance, Martin Scorsese has wanted to do a James Bond film. Steven Spielberg has wanted to do a James Bond film. They're always like, no, because you'll take it over. You'll make it a Steven Spielberg film or a Martin Scorsese film, and it needs to be a James Bond film. So they always hire directors who maybe aren't as well known, but they deliver, a solid Bond film. And that was kind of Marvel's philosophy, where Kevin Feige is the true creative head of that. He kind of determines what stories are going to be told. He'll hire the writers and he'll give them notes on, how he wants these movies to go. And then he'll hire directors, and the directors will basically have to meet his vision of how he wants the movie made. And because you have one person kind of overseeing all this stuff, there's a continuity between it. There's a plan behind it. And we've seen that play out over like 11 films, 21 films. I don't even know how many. But it works, and it's worked with James Bond, and it's worked in other areas. Now with Kathleen Kennedy running Lucasfilm, the issue with her is that, she came from the background of not necessarily being a creative producer, but being like a line producer, I guess you'd say, in the sense that she worked with very talented people, most notably Steven Spielberg. And Steven Spielberg would sit there and he'd be like, I want to have, 10 people in donkey helmets or something, stupid. And she's like, on it, boss. And she'd go find 10 people. She'd go get 10 donkey helmets, and she'd put those helmets on the people and get them on set. And so she was really about executing the vision of very talented filmmakers. And she was very good at that job. Now, when it came time for her to take over Lucasfilm and step into the creative head position, the Kevin Feige position, she kind of took this philosophy of allowing younger filmmakers to kind of come in and run their particular movie. So you had J.J. Abrams with The Force Awakens. You had, what's his name, who did Rogue One?
Gareth Edwards.
Gareth Edwards doing Rogue One. You had Ryan Johnson doing The Last Jedi. And you had Lord and Miller doing Solo. And I think they had a few more people lined up for like a Boba Fett movie and, a few other kind of Star Wars story type things. That eventually got removed from. I know the guy who did the Fan Four Stick, the Fantastic Four reboot, Josh Trank, is that his name?
I'm not sure, but that poor guy. I read stories about what happened with him on set. It was just miserable.
Yeah, but originally he was supposed to do a Star Wars movie, and he got removed. But these are all like young, talented filmmakers who have their own unique voice, and that's kind of who Kathleen Kennedy was always used to working with, were talented filmmakers who had their own unique voice. Yeah. And her job was always to just give them what they needed to make the movie they wanted to make.
You think she was like looking for the next Spielberg and Lucas?
No, I don't think she was looking for the next one. I think she was just looking at the current crop of talented up-and-comers that she could kind of shepherd, to the next phase of their career. Because I mean, she'd sit down, she'd watch these independent films or these other films that these guys had made, and be like, "Yeah, there's talent here. Let's give them a shot at the big time." And unfortunately, because of that, there was no real consistency between the Star Wars films. And more than that, I think it came down to an issue where the development for all these was very rushed. You only had like a year, maybe 2 years in between for the development of these Star Wars movies. And originally, I think Kathleen Kennedy, I forget the name of the writer she was working with, but when Disney first brought her on, and they were kind of getting ready for a new trilogy of Star Wars movies, they had this writer who said, like, look, we need to sit down, we need to plan out all 3 movies at once. I need at least 18 months to properly write and research and do all these 3 movies. And Disney was like, 18 months? No, you got 6. And that's when J.J. Abrams came in and was like, I can do it in 3 months. New
Hope.
Yeah, so like just take New Hope, put in new characters, and then write a couple paragraphs, and that's the outline for episodes 8 and 9. And I think, like, if Disney had actually bothered to sit down and develop all 3 films in the new trilogy at once, and concurrently do these standalone movies in development as well, these movies probably would have turned out a whole lot better. But because of the rushed schedule with which to produce these things, like, they were putting them out 1 Star Wars movies a year, and you need at least a good 2 years to properly develop a film. It kind of got away from them. And I think, I don't agree with how Kathleen Kennedy has been running things, but I think also, she was a good enough producer before she took over Lucasfilm, where she probably knew that this was a rushed job. And she was hoping that bringing in these talented filmmakers, they'd be able to kind of handle the weight load that she was giving them. And unfortunately, like in every instance, it just didn't turn out that way. So I think the reason that she liked Rian Johnson so much is because his production out of all 4 Star Wars movies that they did had the least problems with it. So, in terms of the actual production, where, like, it went very smoothly, Rian Johnson didn't cause any problems with her, he came in on time and on budget and stuff like that. And so that's why she was like, I love this guy, let's give him 3 more Star Wars movies to make. So
we'll see where that I know you've had some theories behind, like, people are like, it's never going to happen, and I don't know enough about the back workings of Hollywood to say whether it's going to happen or not. I hope that it doesn't, just more because of his personality than because of his directing. I mean, The Last Jedi was beautifully shot, like you said. Like, there's a difference between having a beautifully shot movie and a good story. So I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but you had some thoughts behind that about, like, it probably still will, just because the way Lucasfilm works, and it's probably not going to happen for, what do you say, like 6 years or so, 6 or 7 years?
Yeah, at least, possibly 8. Because basically, if you look at the slate that Disney has lined up, Benioff and Weiss, the Game of Thrones guys, they're going to be doing their trilogy. And it looks like Disney has kind of, now that they've recouped their initial, $4 billion investment in buying Star Wars, they're kind of more willing to slow down on the releases. So Episode 9, it's going to come out basically 2 years after the Episode 8.
Yeah.
And, they're not so focused on just getting them out yearly. So if you figure 2 years in between movies, so the first movie in the Benioff and Weiss trilogy will come out 2 years after Episode 9, and then 2 years after that would be the second one, 2 years after that, the third. So before that, like, Rian Johnson, he's just going to be sitting there developing these things. So we're not going to hear about his movie again until, Lord knows, like, 8 years and 10 years down the line. So I think by that time, we're all going to be old and decrepit and not care.
It'll be the same YouTube channels, just with a few 100,000 more subscribers complaining about it.
Jeremy will have white hair on Gamers, and
we'll never know because he won't take off his hat.
Yeah.
So, do you think? I don't want to dwell on Star Wars too much, but just one real quick question before we move on to the next topic. Do you think the anthology films that they had slated are going to be moved on to Disney Plus to try and get to boost the subscribers to that?
I think Disney Plus is going to be a lot more focused on TV, like, original series. It's quite possible that they could make a couple of original films for Disney Plus and set in the Star Wars universe, but they'll probably be more like TV movies. They'll probably utilize a lot of the movie sets and assets that have already been created and try and do smaller films that way. It's really up in the air. I know that, Disney, they have an unlimited bank account basically, so they can basically just do whatever they want. But I honestly think that most of the production for Disney Plus is going to be focused on original series that people can binge, and then they'll have big movie releases every 2 years that they'll market the hell out of. I think mostly you're probably going to see a lot of animated content in terms of Marvel, like Marvel movies that are animated. Probably some Pixar short stuff. The sky's the limit for Disney Plus. Actually, they're going to try to value proposition the hell out of that thing. Just get people to subscribe.
They have so much IP available to them now for Disney Plus. I mean, it's going to be, unless you're really, really hard bent on boycotting everything Disney, it's going to be really hard for people not to want to buy that service. I know,
especially if you have kids.
Yeah, especially if I've got 2 kids, and my wife and I both grew up on Disney movies, and they just announced that they're going to have their entire animated film library, even the vault, even the stuff that's been in the vault for the last 15, 20 years is going to be on Disney Plus eventually. And I'm like, that's impossible to not buy that.
And they have all this stuff from the Disney Channel, like all the live action kid shows and things like that. I mean, they just have so much content that they're going to charge $10 a month to subscribe, and it's like, wow, I get all this stuff for $10. Okay, sure.
Yeah. Last I checked, they said they were going to try and beat Netflix's. They're going to come in under Netflix's price, which is $12 at the minimum for Netflix right now for streaming only.
I mean, for now, Disney can do like a loss leader type thing to kind of come in and steal away some of Netflix's market share and what have you, because they have the money to do that. But eventually it'll probably even out to like $10-12 a month, something like that.
Yeah, probably. Speaking of franchises that we love, you wrote a 4-piece series on Star Trek, and before we get into the details behind that, I wanted to ask you, what is it that spurred you? Because I read the first couple of them. I didn't have time to read all of them. I'm sorry, but I read the first couple, and they went like super, super in depth. And I wanted to get an idea of what made you want to go that far into understanding the inner workings of Star Trek when you wrote that series.
Well, I've always been a Star Trek fan, but I also, one of my first jobs in Hollywood was I worked at Paramount Studios. And I was a page there, which is basically like an intern who gives tours, and I had to kind of help manage audiences for the live tapings of the sitcoms and stuff on the lot. And while I was there, they were shooting the first season of Enterprise, and I'd always been a big Star Trek fan. Not like a diehard Trek fan, but I've watched all the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and stuff like that. So I'd go down to, we called it Star Trek Alley, and it was the street that had all the sound stages for all the Star Trek shows on it. And it was kind of surreal because you'd go walking down there, and Klingons would be hanging outside smoking cigarettes and drinking beer and stuff, and you'd go up and be like, hey, how's it going? And they're like, hey man, what's new? And I'd sneak onto the Enterprise set sometimes and sit in the captain's chair.
No way.
Yeah, and it's funny because Captain Archer. So like it's funny because you can't tell when you see it on TV, but like these things, they're just like basically big wooden walls with all this stuff in there, and they look very different when you're actually on the set as opposed to like seeing it on TV. Yeah. And a lot of people don't know this, but the doors, how the doors are all automatic on Star Trek, where they open as people like are walking towards them and then they shut.
Yeah.
And that's actually done manually by someone, behind the scenes on this pulley thing where they would open the doors and then shut the doors. And it's a union job. So only the door opener guy was allowed to touch that pulley system, and things of that nature. So like we'd go back there and we'd open and close the doors illegally and stuff like that, just for kicks. But anyway, so I had this connection to start Star Trek through working at Paramount. And when I moved out to Vegas to pursue my writing career, I decided that one of the things I was going to do is go to the annual Star Trek convention out here, because the big Star Trek convention, in the United States happens in Las Vegas every August. And since it was like, basically down the street from me, I was like, yeah, like I'll go and I'll sell my books at the convention. And so I did that for a couple years, and it was really great, meeting true science fiction fans and Star Trek fans, and kind of being, in that atmosphere. And for the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, they made a change where basically everything, like all the vendors, everyone who was selling stuff at the convention, had to be pre-approved by CBS Consumer Products to make sure that only licensed Star Trek products were being sold at the event. So that was kind of weird, because before that you had a bunch of like fan-made projects where like they'd sell fan art, they'd sell, they'd raise money for fan movies and things like that. And once the Axanar lawsuit hit, they made this change to make sure that only licensed products were being sold at the event.
So for
and while I was at,
real quick, for those who don't know, can you explain what Axanar is, just for anybody who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, Axanar is just it was a Star Trek fan film, and they raised something. They crowdfunded like $1 million to make this movie, and it was starring a lot of actors from the actual Star Trek TV show and things of that nature. It was kind of like a documentary style movie about this particular event that happened in the Star Trek universe, and it was like the Battle of Anaxar, and they were making another movie called Prequel to Anaxar, or Prelude to Anaxar, or something like that. And that was the one that they actually like raised a lot of money for. And once CBS saw that, they basically banked $1 million off of crowdfunding for this thing, they kind of stepped in and said, nope, you're not going to be doing that. Mm-hmm. So basically they made this mandate that only licensed CBS stuff could be in the vendor hall. And when I was, I was just selling my own book, so it wasn't a big deal to me. So when I was there for the 50th anniversary, one of my friends who has helped me at the booth is a lawyer, and we just kind of started talking about, during one of our downtimes, I was like, hey, really weird this year. They made us all, submit to have our products approved, and they'd never done this before. And he was like, oh, it's probably because of licensing restrictions. And he started kind of giving me a legal breakdown of how some companies, operate their licenses. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So just out of my own curiosity, I went online and kind of started researching this stuff. And I kind of know about licensing just from having worked in the industry, but I didn't know like the actual details of how it worked. So I wanted to educate myself. And then once I started uncovering how CBS, operates, and how the licensing, or how the rights ownership for Star Trek was structured between CBS and Viacom, I was like, this is crazy. This is the most insane thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and not a lot of people knew about it. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna take some time. I'm gonna write an expose that kind of explains this stuff for the common man, so that if you're a fan of Star Trek and you want to know why the franchise is being driven into the ground, this is why. And so I wrote a very long, like 40,000 word novella about Star Trek, its history, its licensing, the corporate mismanagement behind it, and broke it up into 4 different articles that I published on Medium. I was very proud of it. It took me many months of research, and I reached out to people I knew in Hollywood and had them kind of verify or strike down some things for me. And then I published it with great fanfare, and nobody bothered to read it. So, but it's out there. So if people care, they can find it.
Yeah, it'll catch on, I'm sure, especially if Discovery ever does just fall completely apart, or if it actually finds its footing and becomes something that Star Trek fans can be proud of. I'm sure we can put that article out there and people can kind of get a backstory. Like, those kind of things are really useful for people who are maybe doing like documentaries, or if they want to just research, or they want to educate themselves, like somebody like me who just wants to learn more about the business. Those kind of articles are super helpful to people. It might not be like the popular thing, because everything's done with videos nowadays. I bet you if you made like a 4-hour long video about that thing, it would get like 1 million views.
Maybe. I'm not sure people care about Star Trek as much as they used to. But the interesting thing is if you look at the licensing issues that surround Star Trek, A lot of these can be also applied to Star Wars, not in the sense that Star Wars is being mismanaged, but it's how Disney monetizes their properties. And it's funny because like I'll watch YouTube and I'll see a lot of videos from people who are talking about the sky is falling, Lucasfilm has surrendered, or so and so is going to be fired, and blah 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 blah. And I'm just like, no, you don't get it. The licensing revenue for a lot of this stuff is often what saves a movie if it falters. So as long as the brand is strong enough to continue bringing in money through licensing deals, there's no motivation for Disney to actually change anything unless it's like catastrophic. Like I think the failure of Solo was a big strike against Kathleen Kennedy, but it was not so big of a strike that they were going to fire her for it. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, the brand's been damaged, but we're still making a ton of money off licensing, so it's not a critical concern at the
Right.
moment.
And you mentioned before that you can have a producer over something, and you can have, if they're making 4 or 5 different films and one of them fails, it's not always enough. You have to have a couple consistent failures in a row before there's any real change being made, correct?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the general rule of thumb is 3 strikes and you're out. If you make 3 bad movies in a row that lose money, then typically your career is over. Or if
And
you
that's
make one huge bomb that almost sinks a studio, then your career is definitely over.
yeah.
But in terms of Disney, I mean, you got to look at it like this. Disney has Star Wars, they have Marvel, they have Pixar, and then they have Disney properties. And if you look at the number of movies coming out this year, the number of big movies, it's like 60% of them are coming from Disney. you know and so like even if they have a Star Wars movie that, let's say, bombs, they have so many other movies that are going to be a huge hit. Like Endgame, yeah, Solo failed, but Endgame more than made up for it. Or
Yeah.
not Endgame, Infinity War, excuse me. Infinity War, made up for Solo's failure and then some. So I mean, it's kind of like everything evens out in the end. If Star Wars licensing isn't as popular as it was when The Force Awakens comes out, guess what? The licensing for Frozen was even more popular, and that kind of evened out the drop in Star Wars licensing. So these companies don't really see a huge financial hit if a movie underperforms, like Solo, for instance. So that's also one of the things where they're like, okay, we can give Kathleen Kennedy another chance to kind of right the ship and stuff like that. It's not something where it's like, nope, you're out of here. It's like, well, okay, we had a misstep. It's time to switch things up and change strategy or something along those lines.
Yeah. Let's backtrack a little bit back to Star Trek. We were talking about the modern way it's being mismanaged. The only person, I'm not super familiar with producers and the big CEOs of companies like Paramount and stuff, but I know Alex Kurtzman is the one who's kind of show running or started show running Discovery. And you don't have a lot of faith in him. What's the story behind that? Because I know he's done a couple other franchises where he's basically killed them, like the Universal's Dark Universe, which I was like really looking forward to, and it just fell flat on its face with the first movie.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Alex Kurtzman, correct?
Yes, that was Alex Kurtzman. He basically tanked his movie career. He was trying to be an Uber producer, kind of like J.J. Abrams, and he just didn't have the chops for it. He not only helped kill Spider-Man, the Sony Spider-Man universe, which led to them teaming up with Marvel, because he was
was him too.
Yeah, he wrote Amazing Spider-Man 2, and he was set to kind of along with a couple other producers do the Spider-Man extended universe, where they were going to have like the Sinister Six and Venom and all this other stuff, and he was going to write and direct Venom himself. But then after the Spider-Man movie flopped, Sony was just kind of like, you know what, it makes more sense to team up with Marvel to do this, and so we're just going to nix the whole extended Spider-Man universe for now.
Seems to be a reoccurring thing with him, where he always has these big plans to set up these huge, massive franchises, like he's trying to fill Feige's shoes or something.
Well, yeah, I mean, like he's using J.J. Abrams as the model for his career, but it was funny because originally Universal hired him and his partner at the time, Roberto Orsi, to make a reboot of The Mummy and Van Helsing. And it was Kurtzman and Orsi who kind of said, like, hey, you know what? You've got all these great monster properties. You should make a cinematic universe and you should let us run it. And Universal was like, hey, you know, that's not a bad idea. And then Orsi and Kurtzman had a falling out, and Orsi was going to go to Paramount and kind of take over Star Trek, and Kurtzman was going to go to Universal and kind of take over the Dark Universe. And Orsi ended up fucking things up over at Paramount, so he got his butt fired and kind of blacklisted. And then while Star Trek Discovery was being produced, Kurtzman was kind of producer in names only. He didn't have a lot to do with the first season, but he went out and was kind of whole hog into the Dark Universe, which was also being co-produced by the guy who did the Fast and Furious movies. So they had all these different movies set up, and keep in mind, this whole initial idea was basically Kurtzman's to begin with. He's the one who kind of sold the studio on the Dark Universe. And when The Mummy came out and flopped horribly, like it was a major money loser for Universal, they basically canned Kurtzman and this other guy and shuttered all of their future, monster movie projects. And when that happened, the only thing Kurtzman had left to kind of fall back on was this TV production deal he had at CBS, which included, Star Trek. So he runs back to Secret Hideout, which was his TV production company that had this deal with CBS. And he's like, well, I've sunk my movie career, so now I'm going to focus all on television. And that's when he kind of came in and started helping develop the second season of Discovery. And then the showrunners for that show got fired within the first couple episodes of season 2, and he kind of stepped in as showrunner. But he's also the guy who kind of came up with all these different Star Trek shows for CBS All Access, and he went and pitched them to CBS. And they were like, great, more properties to license. We're going to extend your development deal, even though you've proven to be a talentless hack. So
in his defense, I don't know. You said that there's other showrunners that started season 2, and then about halfway through, they kicked him out and he took over, right?
Yeah, Berg and Harberts, I believe.
Okay. So in Kurtzman's defense, I'll just say this. The season premiere of season 2 of Star Trek Discovery was a blatant ripoff on several different Star Trek J.J. Abrams scenes from like Into Darkness. And they also had a couple of things that were like straight from the Orville season 1, like very, very obvious things. And then there was a whole bunch of some like, they had this super obnoxious guy come on the ship, and he was very obviously kind of like the stereotypical left's version of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, I saw the
yeah, and it's on YouTube if you guys want to watch it. He dies within like spoiler. He dies in the halfway through the episode, and he dies while he's he dies while he's mansplaining a subject. And then of course Michael Burnham is like super has like plot armor up the wazoo and can't do anything wrong. And I have to say, the show has, in my opinion, gotten better. And now it's not quite what people would want as far as like a classic Trek. I can understand why people don't like it, but for me, just watching as a casual viewer, it's gotten a lot more subtle with its messaging. It's not so blatant. There's no like real hardcore copying, and I think there's several aspects of classic Trek that are working its way back into the show, where we're doing more of the solve the riddle of the episode. Like, we have to use science to get ourselves out of this trap, and like you were talking about before, where we end up making it worse, and now we have to fix the problem that we ended up causing in the first place. And it's starting to feel a little bit more like classic Trek. So I don't want to give the guy too much rope, but I feel like there is improvement happening, and I'm glad that season 3 is coming up. So hopefully we can continue to improve. Maybe I'm wishful thinking on my end, but I
like to tell people that the Next Generation took 3 seasons to kind of find its footing. So with all the drama that happened behind the scenes with Discovery's kind of development, because the first season was another train wreck of mismanagement behind the scenes. I think that giving the show 3 seasons to kind of decide whether or not it's actually worth Star Trek patronage is fair. Give them some time to right the ship, so to speak.
Yeah.
That being said, like, I've never been a big fan of Kurtzman's. Like, I believe his stuff was always better when he had other people there to kind of keep him in check. And he is a good big idea guy. He's a guy who comes up with these concepts, and he's good at kind of pitching his ideas and stuff like that. But he's always been a very bad writer. Like, he's never been very good at plotting. He's never been very good at dialogue or character development or anything like that. But he was always good at kind of creating these set pieces and stunning, plot twists and things like that. So I don't have a lot of faith in his ability to actually, make a good TV show, but I do have faith in the idea that he might be able to hire people who could. And you got this new showrunner for season 3. I forget her name. I think it's Paradise, Michelle Paradise, something like that. Who is co-showrunning the second half of this season of Discovery, and she's going to be the primary showrunner for season 3. And she's a openly lesbian Canadian filmmaker who basically made a career off of kind of like an L Word type show where she was the main character, like she was the main actress, and she was a lesbian. It was about her lesbian dating life.
Yeah,
and I have no idea how she hooked up with with Kurtzman, but I know that he brought her on to the writing staff, and she was apparently so passionate about Star Trek that he impressed her, or she impressed him, and so he kind of elevated her to running the whole show. So we'll see how she goes. I know that she wrote the 2 finale episodes this season, like the last 2 episodes. So I don't know, like I've never seen her work before. I don't know the quality of her writing ability, but I guess we'll find out.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to check which episode she's done, because I think we're on episode 7 right now, and
I think she did 9 and then 10 and 11 or something like that, or maybe episode 6. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we just had the mid-season finale with the reveal of the new Spock. What's his Mr. Peck? I can't remember his first name. Ethan Peck, I think, and he's a.
Oh, no spoilers. I haven't watched it yet.
Oh, okay. I understand. I'm in the minority especially in our community, but I'm enjoying the show so far. I think Anson Mount, who plays Captain Pike, is probably the best part of the movie or the TV show. And I can definitely criticize the amount of character development you were mentioning, which Kurtzman's not super talented at developing characters, and that's very obvious. I still don't know probably more than half of the bridge crew. If you would compare that to like a Voyager Enterprise, where you know pretty much everybody on the bridge pretty intimately by the second season, you're involved in their lives. Where as opposed to this show, they've really been focusing on a core sector of the crew. Like you got the captain, Burnham, and like 1 or 2 other characters, and that's just about it. So it definitely fails in that sense, where we're not getting that familiar.
Yeah, I remember in the premiere for this season, they actually bothered to sit down and give the bridge crew names. Like there was a whole scene where they're just like, "My name is so and so, and my name is such and such." And I was like, "Wow!" It took them, like 13 episodes to actually name these characters.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was a blatant kind of way of saying, okay, we understand we need to introduce these people finally after a whole season. But so moving forward, so Kurtzman's in charge of the entire franchise for CBS right now. So he's working with Patrick Stewart for the new Picard series, right?
Yeah, the new Picard series was his brainchild. So he was the one who pitched it to Stewart and got him to sign on, and then he was able to go to CBS and be like, "Look, we can do a Patrick Stewart. Remember Patrick Stewart?
Yeah.
Remember the Next Generation?"
I'm not really on board with that. I'm not super happy. I mean, I love Patrick Stewart. Captain Picard is by far the best captain when I think of Star Trek. He's my favorite, and I feel like it's almost, I don't know, it's too easy. It's a blatant like nostalgia rip to try and get people on, and I'm not super enthused by it, especially because I mean Patrick Stewart's an amazing actor, but he's pushing, he's in his 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much longer he's going to be doing things in the acting career. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about it? Do you have any background information about what their story is going to be?
Not really. All I know is, basically there's some type of tie-in to Discovery, in the sense that Picard's adventure is going to somehow relate to what's going on with the Red Angel stuff. That's the theory apparently, but it seems like he's going to be like going on some type of special mission where he's got this ragtag crew around him. I haven't really been paying too much attention to it because I'm kind of one of those people where unless I specifically want to know production specifics, I stay away from them because I don't want to be spoiled.
Right.
I've stayed away from all the episode 9 rumors and things like that because I want to experience it as it's meant to be experienced, when it originally plays out. But I just know that basically the strategy is for Secret Hideout to make a whole bunch of Star Trek content so that CBS All Access can have year-round Star Trek stuff. So once Discovery ends, the Picard series starts. Once the Picard series ends, the Section 37 series starts, and so on and so forth, so that they can continue to keep or retain those subscribers who are paying a monthly fee just for Star Trek.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm the only reason why I don't actually pay for CBS All Access. I have it through a family member, and I haven't looked at their docket yet, but I think Star Trek's probably the only really heavy hitter that they have on that streaming service right now. So,
there's Star Trek has always been CBS's golden goose. It's always been the thing that they've turned to basically save the studio in off years and things of that nature. Because Star Trek is evergreen; it always makes money for them, and it accounts for between 60 and 80% of all of their licensing revenue. So it's the biggest money maker that studio owns license wise. Yeah. So they definitely want to capitalize off of that. And, they take Star Trek very seriously, and especially considering the fact like you have the Big Bang Theory, which is their other huge hit, but that's ending this year. And that's not going to be an evergreen show. Like over time, the interest in licensing for that's going to disappear. Yeah. Whereas Star Trek is going to remain strong. So, they definitely take Star Trek seriously, but they also, CBS looks at Star Trek more as just a way to bilk the fans as opposed to caring about the quality. Like they know that if they slap the Star Trek name on something, the fans are going to be loyal to it. So it doesn't matter what the quality of it is. It can be bad, it can be good, it can be mediocre. They don't care because they know it's going to make money. Yeah. And I think that's part of the big problem with how it's being managed right now.
Yeah, that's a real shame. It's a shame that that's happening more and more to different franchises. And it seems to be like people always complain about these reboots from old classic 80s and 90s movies. And it's 100% true. It's working on nostalgia, getting butts in the theater or buying subscriptions just off of the built name from 20, 30 years ago. And they're just, most often they're not doing it justice, which is kind of a sad thing to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the main competitor that a lot of Star Trek fans are jumping to get their true Star Trek fix, which is the Orville. I haven't watched it yet, and I thought when it came out that it was going to be a straight parody. And it's going to, the guy who ran Family Guy and American Dad was going to do a parody on Star Trek, and it's going to be some goofy nonsense. But apparently it's taken itself pretty seriously. And you guys, the people who like you have been watching it, have been like, this is what we want from Star Trek. So what is it exactly that is driving fans to that show?
Well, the biggest thing is that it's not behind a paywall. So all the new CBS Star Trek stuff is only available on All Access, which you have to pay to watch. Whereas the Orville is free. It's on broadcast TV. So that's probably the biggest thing is people who don't want to have to pay for Star Trek can watch the Orville and not have to pay anything for it. Secondly, it's being made by people who are actually true fans of Star Trek. So for instance, the executive producer of the Orville is Brannon Braga. And he was the guy who, show ran Voyager, and he was the co-creator and showrunner on Enterprise. And he had done writing for, I think, Deep Space Nine, and he was a intern on The Next Generation, kind of worked his way up. So he has a very long Trek pedigree. They have other writers from Star Trek on there, and Seth MacFarlane, the show's creator and the guy who did Family Guy and stuff like that, he's a huge Trek fan, and he wanted to make something that was very much like Trek. And it's funny because the Fox marketing for the show was actually very misleading in the sense that it made it look like a parody, it made it look like a comedy. And though it does have comedic elements to it, it's very similar to the comedic elements in Seth MacFarlane's feature films like A Million Ways to Die in the West and Ted, in the sense that they're kind of absurd comedy moments, but they don't really drive the movie. So you have basically these classic Star Trek stories that are being told on the Orville with a few jokes thrown in. I think one of my favorite ones is every time an alien is speaking an alien language, the subtitles are always like, "Oh, hey man, what's up?" And it's like, it's like, "Oh, hey man, what's up?" It's really funny. And so everyone kind of just talks like they talk, nowadays, where it's like sweetness and, like bitching and, they say these things and you have these great moments. Like, I think it was in the Orville premiere where like they're on the bridge and they're having this conversation with this guy, the scientist on a planet on screen. And in the background, the scientist's dog is on the couch and the dog's just licking his balls. and like, as I'm watching this exchange, I'm just sitting there. I was like, oh my God, that dog is licking his balls. And then after the exchange ends, it cuts to the two helmsmen, and they're just sitting there kind of like nonchalantly tapping on their control panels. And the guy was like, did you see that dog licking its balls? And the guy was like, it was the only thing I saw. and like, that was the moment I knew that the show had won me over, because I was like, okay, not only was that funny, but it was something that was just so normal. Because like, of course, when you're talking to a friend of yours on FaceTime or whatever, dog hops up on the couch, starts licking its balls. It's something that's relatable, but it's in this science fiction show. And so like the Orville has a lot of stuff like that, which makes it very endearing and makes it just different enough from Star Trek. So that, like, it's its own unique thing, but it's also similar enough where true Trek fans are getting their fix from it. I think that's going to be a big thing. In fact, like, if you do have Hulu, I think the first season's on Hulu for free right now, so you can watch it there.
I do have Hulu. I'm gonna have to check it out because that sounds hilarious.
Oh yeah,
that's a stark difference from Discovery. Discovery takes itself very, very seriously, almost to a fault, where it's like there was like no humor whatsoever in the first season, and the only humor in the second season comes from Anson Mount as Captain Pike, where his it's not nonchalant, but it's very casual, and he kind of, when somebody does something stupid, he kind of gives them the look of like that the audience would have, like, why would you do something stupid like that? He has kind of like this little smirk on his face, but there's like no humor in Discovery, and it sounds like that's probably what's driving people towards the Orville.
Probably one of the strongest things about the Orville is that they're able to tackle like political subjects, like stuff that is very much front and center in the culture war. And they don't do it in a preachy way, but they do it in a very interesting way. So for instance, there was this one episode where a race of aliens who basically they're an all male race, and to procreate, one of the males like lays an egg, and it just so happened that this one alien birthed a female, which is like, it's a very bad thing in their culture to be a female. So basically they asked the Orville to take them to their home planet so that they can have their scientists there change the baby's sex from female to male. And this was around the time that in the news there was this big controversy about gender assignments, taking a child and doing a sex change operation on them. And so this episode of the Orville was actually able to tackle this subject in a very interesting way. And they did it without being preachy, and they kind of didn't fall on one side or the other, but it was this interesting moral dilemma. And a lot of Orville episodes actually do this, where they take this kind of like political hot button topic and explore the different sides of it through like some type of crisis that the crew has to go through. And it's very well done. And it's kind of reminds me of how, the old Next Generation and original series kind of tackled some of these issues as well. So I think that that type of stuff really resonates with both political spectrums, as opposed to saying like, oh, if you're a right-wing conservative or something like that, this isn't for you type thing. It's something that they're cognizant of the political differences, and so they try to be respectful of all beliefs, as opposed to coming out in favor of one side or the other.
And that's always a good thing. I think TV shows and movies that do that are almost always seen as a positive thing. Like, you're gonna have to dig through Twitter to find somebody who doesn't like it.
Yeah, and if they did like a mansplaining thing, kind of like how the premiere of season 2 of Discovery did, they would have done it in a funny way,
Yeah.
And I think that's the real difference here. Is a lot of people see the political bent in Discovery as being preachy, as opposed to the Orville, which is way more political, but they do it in such a fair-handed way where you can draw your own conclusion from the episode. And another big thing that I think one of the reasons why the Orville is kind of siphoning people away from Discovery is that Discovery has really gone very adult in some stuff. Like, they've shown nudity, they've dropped the F-bomb. The Orville is very family friendly.
They had Klingon tits in one of the episodes.
Yeah, they did.
And they had a bunch of blood. They did this scene where the Klingons were fighting each other, and it was like straight out of 300. Like, it was just a bunch of like weird fake purple blood all over the place.
Yeah, and I belong to the Star Trek club out here in Las Vegas, and one of the guys who belongs to the club, his young son, who I think is like 9 or 10 years old, is a big Star Trek fan, and it's something him and his dad enjoy together, where like they'll sit down, they'll watch Star Trek together. And it's a father-son bonding thing, and they can't do that with Discovery because the harsh language, the violence, the nudity, but they can do that with the Orville. So I think that's another big thing. It's like, because I remember growing up, I used to watch The Next Generation with my dad.
Yeah, me too.
And, the whole family could sit down and watch The Next Generation some nights. And you can't do that with Star Trek Discovery. And I think that's a big issue.
Yeah. Not only is it's got a paywall, but now it's for audiences that are probably 13 and above.
Oh, I would even say like probably 18.
Really?
Well, if you're going by the movie rating system, it's definitely above PG-13. I'd even say it's close to R territory with the F-bombs and the cursing. Oh yeah.
When? I don't remember that.
Oh, you don't remember the first season where Tilly just out of nowhere just drops the F-bomb for no good reason?
No, I'm gonna have to go back and find that, because that sounds hilarious.
Oh, it was so cringeworthy. Like, when it happened, I was like, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?" Because it came out of nowhere, and it was one of these things where it was Tilly and Stamets together, and Tilly was like, "That's effing awesome," and I'm sitting there, I was like, "Oh my god, why?"
No, that's funny, because in one of the recent episodes, I don't remember if it was the last one or the one before it, but you haven't seen it yet. But Tilly, she was on the bridge and she was doing something, and she said "what the flip" or "what the frack" or something like that along those lines, where they kind of like made it a different word, and I didn't catch it. And now that you're telling me that they used the actual F-bomb in the first season, that makes that even funnier, that they're trying to pull back on that now.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like one of those things where they're like, "Well, we're on a subscription network, we can get away with stuff that we couldn't get on podcast, so let's just go ahead and do it." And it was like, I mean, graphic scenes of torture, Klingon titties, bad language, all this stuff, like graphic violence, and it's like, if this were not a Star Trek show, it'd be fine. I'd be like, whatever. But when you put the Star Trek name on something, there are certain tenets that go along with that you have to abide by. Otherwise, it's not really Trek. It doesn't feel like Trek.
Yeah. And
I think that's the biggest thing between the Orville and Discovery, is like the Orville actually feels like Star Trek. And the Orville just had this big two-parter called Identity. And there's Identity Part 1 and Identity Part 2. And it was up there with some of the best episodes of The Next Generation. I kid you not. It was epic. It was tense. It was dramatic. It really focused on characters, but it also had like a lot at stake. It was a wonderful, wonderful two-parter, and nothing that was in any of the first season of Star Trek Discovery, even the Battle of the Binary Stars, came close to being as good as this 1-2-part Orville sequence of episodes. So, they're definitely doing something right with the Orville.
That's awesome. All right, well, we're working up about an hour and a half, so if you want to wrap it up real quick, if you guys have any questions for Matt, go ahead and start dropping them in the comments. And real quick, Matt, tell me what it is that you love about writing your own stories and being an author.
Not having to deal with people. When I worked in Hollywood, the bane of my existence was having to deal with producers, because they would come in and they would demand you make changes and want you to, adjust things because they want to, appeal to a certain actor, or the producer, didn't like Mormons, so he wanted you to put in an anti-Mormon message in the middle of your screenplay, like weird stuff like that. And the great thing about writing is, like, I can wake up in the morning, I can go into the office in my underwear, I can not shower for 3 days straight. It's all up to me, and I don't have to worry about budgets. I don't have to worry about suiting anyone's unreasonable demands. It's all me. So if people like it, they like what I have to offer them, and if they don't like it, they're rejecting the stuff that I myself came up with. So it always comes down to me, which is something that I really like. And I sink or swim based off of my own talent, and that's something that can be very fulfilling, and it can also be very scary at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. So you're able to sustain yourself off of these books. Where can people find them? Can they look for some of the stuff that you've written?
Well, if they go to kadishbooks.com, KADISH books.com, they'll go to my Amazon author page, and they can see the various books I have up on there. They can also go to MatthewKadish.com, and if they go to EarthmanJack.com, they can sign up for my newsletter and get the first book for free.
Oh, nice!
If they want to check it out. And I'm sustaining myself on this. Like, I'm not Stephen King levels or anything of pulling in royalties, but I make enough to pay my bills.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. A lot of people don't have that opportunity. Like, I'm doing this podcast on the side, and I'm not expecting anything from it. I love doing it. So I wanted to pick up a hobby someday, hopefully, if it actually does pick up and I can do it and, sustain myself off of it. That would be fantastic. So that's got to be a great feeling to have.
Yeah, and it's not a hobby for me. It's a career, and so I take it very seriously. And I'm always working on new books, trying to get more books out there. And there's actually a really great independent author community out here in Las Vegas. So I've made a lot of good friends. We kind of get together and mastermind and talk about our books and stuff like that. So it's kind of like a strange bohemian lifestyle that I'm living, but I love it, and I hope I can keep doing it. And hopefully, people start reading the books and liking them, and checking out my new stuff when it's put out there.
Oh, I'm enjoying it so far for sure. Like I said, I'm on like chapter 4, I think, and it's right up my alley. Where you got that Spielberg-esque young adult adventure, not the Goonies, more along the lines of like Star Wars and whatnot, where you have this or Back to the Future or something.
Yeah, Back to the Future was a big influence. Like I said, all the movies I grew up loving are kind of influences in there. And it's kind of funny because, talking to different people who've read it, they all get something unique out of it in terms of like, oh, this felt like such and such to me. And so it speaks to a wide variety of people. We've had a lot of success with, getting kids interested in reading because, they'll read this book and they'll be like, oh, wow, that was cool. I want to read more. So I get emails from parents who are like, your book got my kid into reading. Thank you so much. Stuff like that. So it really is kind of like an all ages, like fun fantasy, science fiction, adventure series that's meant to appeal to people of all ages, all races, all political beliefs, stuff like that. Yeah. And it's basically just meant to be fun. And I'm not trying to preach to anyone or put out some type of message or anything like that. I'm just trying to make a fun story that everyone can enjoy.
Are you going to stick to that genre, or are you going to move into like a different like horror? Are you going to do like a horror book, or I know you sent me a little snippet from some a detective book. What
Mhm.
other areas are you going to move into?
So I've got a couple of different series that I'm working on right now. One of them is a mystery set in Las Vegas. It's contemporary. Um, but I've got a couple of spin-offs from the Earthman Jack universe. So one of them is called Rook and Behringer, and it's kind of like a sci-fi buddy cop uh, western in the sense. It's kind of like, I like to say it's like Firefly meets Lethal Weapon. It's about these two kind of galactic rangers who kind of hop about the galaxy solving different types of crime.
That's awesome.
And then I've got one called Exploratory that I'm working on, which is kind of like my take on Star Trek, and it's about the Galactic Empire in my Earthman Jack novels. It's about the exploratory service, where there's this ship that its job is to go out and map unexplored areas of space. And basically, the premise behind it is that they used to have the captain and the high-ranking officers go down to explore these new planets, and too many of them were dying. So instead of putting these highly trained officers' lives at risk, they take kind of the dregs, the expendables, and create an exploratory team out of them and start sending them down there, because if they die, it doesn't really matter. And so it's about this group. It's kind of like a Suicide Squad type group, in the sense that like they're all a bunch of rejects, in this Breakfast Club type rejects, and somehow they, just through camaraderie and working together, they always end up saving the day. So it's kind of like my version of Star Trek, and it's meant to be kind of tongue in cheek and funny, but at the same time, a fun adventure tale. So I've got that going on, and I've got a number of other kind of science fiction related stuff in the pipeline as well. One of the other things that I'm working on is a urban fantasy series, which is set in New Orleans. It's kind of like a voodoo urban fantasy story. And I'm also doing one called Evil Sherlock Holmes. And that series is about what if Sherlock Holmes was a serial killer instead of a detective, and who could stop him in terms of like, his brilliance. And it's set, during the original 1800, early 1900 time period.
Nice.
And I've got about 100 pages of that written. I need to finish that up, but that one's been a lot of fun as well. So I've got all these things kind of in the pipeline. I just need to find time to get them done, because right now I'm trying to get my next Earthman Jack book out, so I haven't been focusing on all this other stuff.
Awesome, man. Well, you got yourself a new fan for sure. I'm going to be checking out your work more, because I'm loving the Earthman Jack so far. Okay, so cool. Hey, man, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. We're about an hour and a half, so perfect timing for one of my podcasts. I really appreciate you stopping by and talking with me and telling everybody a little bit about yourself. I know you're a big voice on Twitter. A lot of people look at you for some background information or maybe opinions about what's going on in Hollywood. So I wanted to give the opportunity for people who might be a fan of yours on Twitter to get to know you a little bit more personally.
Oh, I appreciate that. And, I don't consider myself an expert on anything, but I have had experience in the entertainment industry. So I like to try to be the voice of reason, or at the very least, play devil's advocate with a lot of the people on Twitter and YouTube, to try and, just kind of bring them down to earth a little bit and get them to defend their positions a little bit stronger. Because I do think that outrage culture happens on both sides of the political aisle. And it can be kind of tiring to see people that we agree with, for the most part, like you and I, in terms of how Star Wars is being handled and stuff like that, kind of go a little bit too extreme in their opposition to what Hollywood's doing, and not understanding the reality behind, how Hollywood makes its decisions and stuff like that. So, I feel like if everyone just knows how this stuff actually works, then they're better able to critique it and offer suggestions for change and things of that nature. Because the worst thing that can happen is that you base your outrage on stuff that is fiction. That's stuff that you think is real, but the people in Hollywood know is not. And then they're like, well, we're going to dismiss everything you say because you obviously don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. And it lessens your argument when something actually legitimate comes up.
Exactly. So like, I'm hoping that, I can kind of step in and tell people, hey, this is actually my understanding of how this works, and I'm pretty sure that my understanding is accurate. So you may want to adjust your argument based off of this information and so on and so forth. So that's basically what I do on Twitter all day, is just tell people like, hey, I'm smarter than you. Listen to me.
Anybody anybody who knows me, they know that the last thing I want to do is the outrage culture thing, and I always try to play devil's advocate, especially with my boys in the Senate. I'm always fighting back with them. Like, if they'll say something, I'll argue with them just for the sake of having a different opinion, because the last thing I want is for our community to become an echo chamber. I think
it's important to respect differing opinions. Like, you can debate them, you can argue them, but when you get to the point where you're actively attacking people who maybe share a different opinion than you've already lost the argument, in my opinion. So, I think it's important to have these exchange of ideas and be open to them, and really try to, figure out what's real and what isn't. Because I've had that experience where people who, I guess are on our side of the aisle, in the sense that they don't like how Star Wars is being treated by Disney and Lucasfilm currently. I've come out and said, like, well, Kathleen Kennedy's not going to be fired because of these reasons. And then they're like, oh, you're a double agent. You're working for the other side. You're trying to undermine our position and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, no, I'm just trying to offer a different perspective for you guys. And so I think intolerance, whether it's on one side of the aisle or the other, is just never the way to go. Like, you always need to kind of keep an open mind and, just be open to differing opinions.
Yeah, that's an uphill battle on Twitter for sure.
It really is.
But I'm glad that there's somebody out there like-minded, and there's a bunch of us. A lot of the guys in the Senate are the same way. They're very speaking of the Senate, I want to do a quick shout out to those guys. Sith, Drunk 3PO, Kester, Proper Jeremy. You guys are awesome. They're probably the best part about me being on Twitter is being able to converse with those guys. And then I got included into your group chat as well, which is a lot of fun. So thank you for that, by the way.
Yeah, no problem.
And where can people check you out? Go ahead and do your Twitter account so people can look you up.
Yeah, they can find me at MatthewKadish.com. That's MatthewKadish. Not .com, just at Matthew Kadish, sorry. That's my Twitter handle. If they want to join my Facebook group where we talk about movies, TV, pop culture, all that stuff, they can go to www.eggfbgroup.com. And if they want to check out my books, you can go to Kadish, Kadish books.com, and that'll take you to my Amazon author page. And I'm also on YouTube. I think it's youtube.com/Matthew Kadish author or something like that. But if you go to Kadish video, Kadish video.com, it'll take you right to my YouTube channel. And I want to try to do more videos. It's just about finding the time and topics I actually want to talk about, because I got the face for radio, so like I don't want to do too much in terms of video content, especially because I got so much book writing I need to do. But it's always fun to kind of throw up a rant every now and then and talk about an issue I care about.
There's a reason why I started a podcast. I don't have the patience to do video editing. I can just I can edit like one or two little things out of a podcast and throw it up online and be done with it.
I come from a filmmaking background, so for me, I'm always fighting the urge to do these like super complicated, well shot, storyboarded videos and stuff. I put up a video about Captain Marvel, I think it was yesterday or something like that, and it was just like me reading off a script and set to basically an image. And at the beginning of the video, I'm like, I'm sorry for the poor quality of this video, because I didn't want to do anything fancy for it. I just wanted to get it up and get it out there. But my inclination is always to do stuff that is very kind of over the top and fancy, and I just don't have the time.
Yeah. Well, hey man, keep writing those books. I can't wait to dive into this Earthman Jack thing. And it sounds like you got a lot of other stuff that I'd be really interested in too, especially with that Firefly vibe that you were talking about with those two characters, the buddy cop thing. So keep doing what you're doing, man. You're doing good work, and I appreciate you and the community, and I'm sure a lot of other people feel the same way.
Thank you. And as always, I'm always happy to come on your podcast, because you're a lot of fun to talk to.
Yeah, for sure, man. I appreciate it. I'll definitely keep that in mind. I'm trying to. Me and Dusty had just finished off our influences trilogy. So him and I are discussing the future. What are we going to do moving forward? So I'll definitely keep you in mind when I need to do something.
I think you and I should have a big debate on Goonies sometime.
Oh, Jesus. I don't know. I don't know about that one. I'll probably lose, but all right, guys. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate everybody who stopped by in the live chat, and anybody who's listening to this later on. You guys can catch me at Salty Nerd on Twitter or at Salty Nerd Podcast on Instagram, where I do most of my work. I'm also on the new social media Minds. I do a couple posts there, not very much. But if you happen to be very against censorship and want free speech, and you don't want Twitter or Facebook digging into your contacts, Minds is a great option to go to. They don't do any of that stuff. And yeah, anyway, thank you. Have a great night. You can catch this podcast on YouTube. I will upload it to iTunes probably sometime tomorrow, so keep an eye out on that. You can subscribe, leave a review, do all those cool things that people do. And have a great night, everybody. See you later.